Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast, where it's all about turning your job search into a slam dunk. Your host is Angela Copeland.
Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Angela Copeland. Live on the phone with me today, I have Cheryl Rich Heisler in Chicago, Illinois. Cheryl is the president and founder of her Chicago-based business, Lawternatives, through which she helps lawyers to negotiate career transition. As a former large law firm practicing attorney turned Kraft Foods associate brand manager, Cheryl has experienced the joy of career change firsthand and went on to coach others through the process. Cheryl, thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Angela. It's my pleasure.
Well, as I mentioned, you're in Chicago, and we're recording this the day after the World Series.
The history-making day in Chicago. We're going to talk career change, but I think there's something very motivational in the fact that if the Cubs could make it work after 108 years, each and every one of us can do something to make our careers more fulfilling and happy, and I hope we don't have to wait that long.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, so are you watching the parade today?
I had it on in the background this morning, and I've got it taping now for future generations of Cubs fans.
That's perfect. Well, as I mentioned in the introduction, you actually transitioned your own career from law, you were a lawyer, to a brand manager. And I'm just curious, what inspired you to make such a big change?
Well, the very first thing I noticed about practicing law was that it really wasn't me. I knew it in law school. I didn't really enjoy the process. I worked for a firm after my first summer. I guess I did a good job. They gave me an offer for when I graduated, and I spent the rest of law school just sort of getting through, getting married, realizing at some point I would actually have to practice law, and the practice wasn't fun. It didn't utilize my best skills. And in fact, for a person who loves to talk and loves to socialize and loves to be out there and out, it was a lot of detail work and a lot of research and a lot of being stuffed into my office alone. And I realized early on that I wasn't in a great fit. It wasn't the right place for me to be. So the big change, of course, was to marketing. And the story is, and I think what ultimately led to the rest of my career in opening up Lawternatives, is how do you find what that next step is going to be? Because I didn't know. I didn't have this perfect answer in the back of my brain. It took a long time to figure out what was wrong with law for me, where the fit wasn't right, and why brand management and marketing was holding something that I liked. And ultimately, what I did during those transition months is what led to the basis for starting Lawternatives and understanding what anybody else has to go through when they just know they're not happy in one field but want to find something else that is going to fulfill them on a job professional level.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. So how common do you think that issue is for people coming out of law school?
Oh, it's very common. I mean, I've been in this business long enough to know that there are ups and downs in the legal field, right, just like there are in any field. And sometimes I'll have clients coming in because there's too much work and law is taking over their lives. And then I'll hit a period where they're coming in because law doesn't have enough work for them, or there aren't enough jobs like we saw in the recession where lawyers were being laid off left and right. But the underlying theme throughout all the clients over all the years is I chose law school and I didn't really understand what the practice of law was going to be all about. Mm-hmm. And so the unhappiness comes not from law being a bad profession, but mostly from where it is not a fit for the individual. And maybe they chose it because someone said you should be a lawyer, right? It's, mm-hmm. It may be the profession that people love to hate, but it is a profession. It is prestigious. There is the sense that, gee, once I get a law degree, I'll be set for life. And the reality is, it's not right for everybody. It's not a guarantee of making a decent living, and it's not always a good way to spend your time. It can be very adversarial. It can be very detail-oriented, and it can be very much less creative than I think some lawyers think it's going to be when they sign up for law school.
You just said something really interesting that hit a chord with me, and that is that people assume that you're kind of set for life. And I had a conversation with a friend last week, and I mentioned that, I often talk to lawyers who are interested to switch their career. And the friend said, well, that seems impossible. Like, law is such a great job. So
put your friend in touch with a lot of people who would see it differently.
Well, so for our listeners who may not be lawyers, why would a lawyer possibly want a career change?
Well, I think law is one of those fields that's been very much dramatized in the media, right? You see shows like L.A. Law, or you read books like To Kill a Mockingbird, and I've actually had clients come in and say that's what's influenced them. While you know the difference between fiction and reality, sometimes you think, well, gee, maybe that's what lawyers really do, or that's what what all lawyers are about. It's exciting, it's glamorous, you get paid a lot of money, and everything wraps up in 30 or 60 minutes. It's not the case. The law is a very detailed profession. It requires not just a ton of schooling, but a ton of effort. People complain about billable hours because it takes a lot of hours to get anything done. If you're in a litigation kind of practice, you're constantly butting heads with the other side, and as the world at large has gotten more contentious, it's gotten much uglier in the courtroom as well. If you're a transactional lawyer, you've got to be realizing that your clients are always going to want you to do more for them at a lower cost, so you're fighting with your own clients as well as with the other side. Often your own partners are unhappy that you either cut your bill or you spent too many hours doing the work that needed to get done, so you face opposition and frustration on all sides. So at the end of the day, you throw up your hands, say, hey, I did a good job for this client, but he was unhappy it cost too much, or the partners were upset that I didn't bill more. So the business, a lot of that does go to the business model for law firms. It's not just a profession anymore, it's a business. And I think that's impacted a lot of why more lawyers are unhappy now than perhaps in the good old days.
Mm-hmm. And as you mentioned, it seems like there's much more paperwork to be done than I think lawyers may anticipate when they're in school.
First of all, it's a paper-intensive kind of practice, from the reading and the writing and the multiple copies, that's for sure. But now you also do in memos and in everything you do, you kind of cover your backside, because there is this fear that the litigation is going to come from an internal source as well. Your own client can turn around and sue you. So that's one of the many frustrations that I hear from my clients. And the idea that it's not the kind of job that you leave at the office. You might work 8 in the morning till 6 at night, but you go home with the issues and the concerns of your clients on your back. And not that there isn't something to be said for being a confidant and for helping people with their problems. That's why a lot of people do enjoy the law, but sometimes that spills over into what precious little free time people have. And a lot of times I'll have people come into me and say, I want to do good, I want to help, but I want to be able to go home and have a life of my own as well. And there's that old phrase, the law is a jealous mistress. I think that's very true for practicing lawyers, especially ones who care a lot. It can be very, very weighty.
Well, speaking of time, you mentioned it took you quite a while to kind of figure out what it was that you wanted to do. I'm curious how much time actually passed between, when you started thinking about doing something different and when you actually landed the job at Kraft.
Well, that's a great question. I think I started thinking about doing something different my first year of practice, although I did stay into my third year in a corporate practice with a large firm in Chicago. What happened that really got things going for me, and it's kind of a fun story. My husband and I were in New York, and we were tasting we went to this little ice cream shop, and they had this wonderful ice cream. And at the time, I had never heard of a company called Ben and Jerry's. But it was so good, I said, wow, this ice cream would do great in Chicago. And I've always been interested in food and food products. I actually had an undergraduate degree in advertising, which may have been a little telltale sign. But when I went back to Chicago, I tried to track down the source of that ice cream and called this person back at the little dip shop in the village, and back and forth. And lo and behold, about 2 o'clock this afternoon, I remember it like it was yesterday, my phone rings, it's my secretary, and she says, there's a partner for you on line 1, right? We were talking about some tax deal. And then she buzzes me again, and she says, there's a guy by the name of Ben Cohn on line 2. And I said to the partner, I'll call you back. And the thought of maybe I can do something with this wonderful ice cream guy, I don't know what it is, but it was so much more exciting than the tax problem I was working on that earlier that afternoon. It was an aha moment. And I realized I got to get out of this and do something that really makes me want to get up in the morning and learn. And what happened was there was a whole follow-up with Ben and Jerry. My husband and I met with them. They came to Chicago. We met them out on the road one time. Actually created a marketing plan for bringing Ben and Jerry's ice cream to Chicago. This is long before they got taken over by Haagen-Dazs, and that all played out. And the experience, while it didn't come to fruition, made me realize that marketing could be really fun, especially some kind of a food product that everybody was interested in. That was the genesis of my being able to put a label on what I wanted to do, and that there was this, and then I learned, right? Then you go and you research. There is a position in marketing. It's called brand management. You can work with companies that have, like Kraft foods, that have very real and the kind of product that's in everybody's household. So in going through my process, and I'll come back and outline the steps, and by the way, at the time I didn't know this was a process. I was sort of working it through on my own. I was able to talk to enough people in marketing and understand what that business is all about and tie it back to what I had learned in college as an advertising major and also what I had learned in law that was transferable, and put together the right kind of resume and attach that marketing plan that I had done for Ben & Jerry's. Even though it didn't do the trick for them, it was a concrete way to show the people in the marketing world that I kind of understood this game and tell the story of why I wanted to get into it.
Wow, I've got to tell you, that's probably the best job transition story ever.
It's fun to tell people about it because I think it does show how a passion, in this case I guess a passion for ice cream, led me to go on this hunt. Because I had talked to other people. When I knew I was unhappy in law, somebody said, well, go talk to people. This was before everyone was talking about networking. So I would go talk to anybody doing anything, and I kept striking out. I kept talking to people, but what they did sounded worse than what I was doing. So, the old thing about kissing a few frogs, it took me till I was able to actually see and in a tangible way put my hand on this idea of going into marketing and put a label on it that then helped me understand how I was going to execute. And when we get to the how-to phase of this interview, I don't think everybody has to be as lucky as I was. My process allows them to find a way to identify and put a tag on the kinds of things they think they want so that when they start their own networking and searching, they're already talking to the right people. They're fishing in the right pond.
Mm-hmm. So I may have missed it, but between the time that you kind of started, thinking about this, talking to Ben and Jerry, and eventually ending up at Kraft, how much time passed?
I think it was probably about a year start to finish.
That's really good.
Yeah, and I was young enough in my practice of law that I was still learning. It wasn't like I have to get out of here, I'm so bored or I can't stand it. But I knew that the environment wasn't right. And what I appreciate now is the time that I spent in the discipline that I learned in the law firm would pay off down the road, especially now because I'm working with lawyers. I have a real good understanding of what frustrated lawyers are dealing with because I was there.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I'm curious, when the job at Kraft came up, how did you land it? I mean, did you know someone? Did you apply online? What did you do?
I had, through my networking, I had met a woman who was a marketing headhunter. And she said, well, I can't really help you change careers, right? Because that's not how recruiters get paid. Mm-hmm. And I think by the time I got to meet her in person, I had all my ducks in a row. I had done my networking. I understood what I needed to say to be a credible candidate, and I had that marketing plan. So she went out on a limb, and she introduced me to Kraft Foods and Quaker Oats and some of the other companies in the Chicago area, and she said, that's all I can do. I can open the door. You've got to go in and sell it. So armed with what I understood about these industries from having done a lot of, again, what wasn't called networking back then, but essentially was, just undercover research, I was able to get in front of people and make it clear that I understood the ins and outs of their business and was able to sell them both on my advertising undergraduate background and the transferable skills that came out of my legal experience. And what's so interesting is that when you can put the dots together, connect the dots for somebody, and I tell this to my clients too, they don't have to work so hard to stretch to see you in that role. In the case of moving from law to brand management, what I didn't have was the MBA. Kraft tends to hire MBAs for entry-level management positions. So that a large part of my job was selling the similarities between the JD, an early work experience, and an MBA, an early work experience. And ironically, the hardest part of that was selling the hard business skills and the number crunching skills because I didn't have that. And you know what? Ultimately, where I think I got real frustrated with marketing was when there were significant financial analyses and regression analyses and looking at all the number stuff. One, I wasn't geared up for that. Two, I didn't really like it. And that's where, had I continued on in that path, I might have had to go back to get the MBA. There's a reason that they ask for it. But it's not that you can't do the job, at least at the entry-level positions.
No, that's really interesting. So what were those specific transferable skills that you kind of pitched when you went in and talked to these different employers?
Well, one of the things that a lawyer has, and like it or not, or get teased about it or not, there's a certain cachet that goes with OJD, right? And people, if nothing else, it's a synonym for saying you're smart. You can take tests. You can understand details. You can stand up to pressure. So all of that is sort of wrapped up in the JD itself. But the other skills that you gain from having gone through law school and certainly in practicing are communication skills. Whether you're a transactional lawyer or a litigator, you have to be able to communicate both orally and in writing. So those are things right away that are helpful, certainly in a marketing environment and in most other environments. You have to be able to be persuasive. You have to be able to be concise. You have to be a good listener. You have to be able to understand context. When somebody says one thing, what do they really mean? When a client gets mad that they say, they have to have a certain point in a contract. If you're a good lawyer, you get underneath that demand and understand what they're really looking for. So you read between the lines. Those are skills that are meaningful in almost every other industry. And if you understand what your new industry requires, and then you sort of reverse engineer it and go back to what you do on a daily basis as an attorney and unbundle the skills. For instance, it wouldn't have helped me get into Kraft to say I draft contracts. They weren't hiring me to draft contracts, but if I were able to break it down and say, I understand what makes a good deal. I understand what motivates people to make a decision, right, whether it's a contractual decision or a purchasing decision. Those kinds of broken down, unbundled skills are very meaningful in another context. And I think that's true for any career changer. The transferable part, who you are, how you communicate, how you interact with people, those skills go with you wherever you go. But the technical skills, if you're an engineer and you make a change, or if you're a lawyer and you make a change, or if you're a doctor and you make a change, you're not going to be practicing medicine anymore. The fact that you can, start an IV is in and of itself very possibly not meaningful. But the fact that you're compassionate, the fact that you can calm somebody down, the fact that you know how to listen to what is perhaps bothering them, and then be able to offer them solutions. Those kinds of things are very transferable and often are the difference between making a career transition and not succeeding in it.
Well, I'm curious, you talked to more than just Kraft in this transition. Did every hiring manager buy into this idea that you could make this change, or was... Okay.
A lot of it is chemistry. And when I got my job at Kraft, it was really interesting to talk to the people who had interviewed me and get there. Once I was there for a while and we were friendly. And one person said, and I share this with my clients all the time, one person said, my mother had wanted me to be a lawyer, and I didn't do that. He said, I was determined not to hire you. Because I didn't want to give my mother the satisfaction of knowing that a lawyer can still do what I do too.
Oh my gosh.
So what that always reminds me of is you as a candidate never know what's in the mind of the job interviewer. You could be a great candidate, but if they don't like, in my case, redheaded people, you don't get the job. So that was one learning that I had, and I always keep that in the back of my mind. But another was one of the people who I interviewed with knew my undergraduate institution and recognized one of the awards I had gotten. I went to the University of Illinois, and I got on something called Bronze Tablet, which is upper 3% of graduating class. And he said it wasn't the law degree, but the fact that I had made bronze tablet in college that reassured him that I was smart enough to learn his job.
Oh, well, that's great.
It's just funny that in the perfect world, I believe that when you find the right fit, all the things that you've done in your past, whether they were, exceptional or whether they were troublesome, sort of come together and make you the ideal candidate. And something like the bronze tablet, which I didn't think about, I mean, I used it to get into law school, it was important, but then I didn't really think about it anymore. It made a difference to somebody down the road.
Absolutely. Well, so I'm curious, at Kraft, what were the particular products that you worked on?
When I started, I worked on Parquet margarine.
Okay.
And that was just a hoot because everybody knew about Parquet. And then when I got my first promotion, I moved to Kraft. I was on Kraft Real Mayonnaise. That's right. And that's an interesting job because Miracle Whip is, sort of the place where everybody wants to be, but in Kraft, mayonnaise is a second-class citizen. But that led me then to work on new products where I had a ton of fun. It was creative and it was new ways of thinking about things, which is probably a theme through my life. I like looking at things through different lenses. But when I went on my first maternity leave, they called back and said, "Congratulations on the baby. We're going to offer you a new position with Miracle Whip when you come back."
Oh, wow.
And for me, while that was the crown jewel, it also meant less, I viewed it as less flexibility, less freedom, less creativity. And this idea of starting to coach lawyers had been on my mind already. So with the birth of my first son, I decided I would also birth my business. And that's when Lawternatives got started. And he's going to be 30 years old next year, so that tells you a little bit something about how long I've been working with lawyers in transition.
Oh, that's awesome. So when you worked on Parquet, were you there during the commercials where the Parquet package talks?
Not only was I there, there's a great story where we tried to take the talking Parquet cup with us once on an airplane to a show meeting, and it was before, security was what it is today, but they were flipped out. There was a little package with remote control kinds of things, and it was not the, put it this way, security really wanted to see it work before they'd let us on that plane.
Oh my gosh, that's so funny. That's a great story. Well, so once you were at Kraft, what was your personal observation about the difference between working as an attorney and working in a corporate environment from a kind of cultural perspective?
It's very different, and the thing that got me from the first day, when you're at a law firm or in any kind of a service business, or actually a retail business as well, the phone rings, you pick it up because there's a client on the other end, or there could be. Kraft was a big corporation, and the phones would ring and go to voicemail, and I remember thinking, I like being on the end of things where it's kind of a service situation. I like that immediacy. There's a client who needs help. And so I didn't love the big corporate environment. There's also a lot of bureaucracy. Not that there isn't in law firms, but it's often a more direct connection. The client calls you directly. And you might have to go up the chain to get some advice, but you can get right back to the client. It's still an attorney-client relationship, even if you're the youngest attorney on the deal. In big corporations, especially between marketing firms and ad agencies, for example, there's a pecking order. And you're sitting in a meeting, and if the head of the ad agency asks a question, it has to be at least it used to be, the head of the marketing group has to answer. And so I wasn't used to being low man on the totem pole that way. I was in a group of professionals where we all shared ideas. And I didn't really like that. You couldn't speak up. You weren't deemed to have really much to say if you were lower down. Part of that came out when I opened my own career consulting business. And when I work with lawyers, I work with, from the beginning, junior associates and senior partners, and I've even seen judges who are unhappy in their judicial positions. I get to talk to everybody. I don't have to wait till somebody else speaks and not in agreement. If I have an opinion, I can share it, and that's very much more my personality. And probably, if I look back on when I started practicing law, the uncertainty and the tentativeness that you're sort of forced into, especially as a new lawyer, because if you're not sure, you don't want to give somebody the wrong advice. That was very difficult for me. I know how I feel about things. I like to help people. I like to advocate for people and teach them to advocate for themselves. And it's much easier to do now as a president of my own business than when I had to say, well, no, this is the way I do. I can't speak until this one speaks. And I don't care much for the corporate environment. I don't have a lot of patience for it.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you think that was probably the most frustrating part of making the transition, sort of that political pecking order that you described?
That was part of it. And then once you learn the ropes, knowing that you have to stay in most jobs a year before you move. It felt very lockstep. And honestly, the number crunching became harder and harder for me as you rose up the chain. More and more of that was expected. But luckily, and I guess this is another important story. While I was at Kraft, there was an article that came out in one of the Bar Association publications. I think it was maybe it was either the American or the National Bar Journal, and it was called "The Best and the Brightest Bored and Burned Out." And this was the first article that I remember where they talked about lawyers being unhappy at the practice, because that was around the time when the business model was changing. And someone had given them my story, and they came out to Kraft, and they followed me around, and they took pictures. And when that hit, and it was before the Internet, people actually got hard copies of the magazines, lawyers from all over the country tracked me down at Kraft. And they said, "How did you get out? Can you help me?"
Wow.
And it was like, sure, let's talk. And they would listen, and then they'd call me back, and that worked. And that's when it really all clicked. My move from law to marketing was nice, but it laid the foundation for Lawternatives, which was the business I ultimately started and have been successful with over the last almost 30 years, using those experiences to help other lawyers take their skills or other professionals and translate those skills into things that they can do in other industries, often with other titles, or they could be quasi-legal or even non-legal titles, but add benefit and feel good about what they do, or they weren't getting that satisfaction in the law.
Right. Well, are there any sort of typical paths that you're seeing lawyers take, like other certain careers that they pursue more than others?
That's a dangerous question.
Oh, okay.
And I'll tell you why, and then I'll answer it. I think a lot of times people who have put as much time and money into a career are ready for the next step. If they're unhappy, they want to move. And so as soon as you offer up, here's a list of 5 things lawyers have done, I worry that people will go say, okay, those are my 5 options, I'm going to move to one of them, where in fact the options are infinite. I know of or have worked with or have heard of lawyers that have gone into everything from the funeral business to the dance business to nonprofit or the arts or education or tie making or furniture making. It is as broad as who those people are. So the better way to ask the question for an individual starting to think about what they want to do is, who am I, what do I want to do, and how do I use my legal background to get there? Having laid that out, sure, there's an affinity between law and communication jobs. There's an affinity between law and advocacy jobs or law and governmental jobs. If you come from a transactional background, it's not uncommon to see lawyers going over onto the business side. So education, lawyers are often good teachers because they can take the complex and break it down in a way that other people can understand. So I could give you compliance. Now you hear about a lot of lawyers moving into the compliance arena because compliance takes detail orientation and the ability to read regulations and to understand it and explain it. So all of those are jobs that lawyers could certainly consider. But let me reiterate, you got to start, I believe, with who you are and what you want, and then say, now how do I use my background to bootstrap me into those positions? And in fact, and just jumping ahead a little bit, whenever I start with a client, the first process, I believe, has got to be a self-assessment process. Who are you? What do you want? And what do you want now? It may be different. It might have been different 5 years ago. It might be different 5 years down the line. But right now, are you looking for flexibility? Are you looking for creativity? Are you looking for intellectual stimulation? Are you looking for a 9-to-5 job because you have little kids and that's all you can handle right now? Who you are, to me, is, and what you're looking for and your value match and what is easy for you to get excited about, those are the places you have to start a job search.
Absolutely. And I think the thing, too, is that those values and priorities really can change over your life.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I had a client early on in my career who was ready to walk away from a partnership at a big firm where she was making a lot of money and was very well respected. And in the course of our discussions, where the frustration really was for her was the fact that she had a daughter about to go off to college, and she was having, I guess, issues, and she'd been a single mom, and she spent enough time with her daughter, and where we worked through this was in negotiating a sabbatical with her firm. So she had that time with her daughter, and then when her daughter was off being busy with her own things, she went back with renewed excitement and passion for her role as a partner at a law firm. So it didn't necessarily even mean changing careers. It just meant getting the timing right.
Oh, that's really fantastic. I'm sure she completely appreciated not turning everything upside down to solve a temporary issue.
Right. And in the thinking, you do turn it upside down. You have to ask those tough questions. But the response or the correct answer isn't always, to run from the law. There was a great book years ago, the author since passed away, named Deborah Aaron, and it was called Running from the Law. And it was the first book I ever read where people would bare their souls and say why they weren't happy practicing law. And you asked early on in the podcast, well, what people can't understand, isn't the law perfect? Well, it's not. And sometimes, at least back then, as a lawyer, you say you're unhappy and nobody could understand it. So this book brought out into the sort of public eye all these things that were making people unhappy in the practice of law, and it gave a certain cold comfort, to use a legal term, to other people who were saying, this isn't right for me. Is there something wrong with me personally, or is it part of a bigger problem inherent in the profession? And of course now everybody talks about it, but back then it was a real eye-opening little book.
Well, so once we kind of figure out who we are and what we want, we start to go out and have these kind of informational interviews or interviews like you mentioned that you did. And one of the first things that we often get asked is, tell me about yourself. And when you're making a big career change, that can be kind of a tricky question. Do you have any tips for those of us who may be switching from one career to another, whether it's from law to marketing or some other profession? I mean, what should we keep in mind?
Well, let me go a half step back and then address the question.
Sure.
I absolutely think that self-assessment has to be the way to start out. And I do think the networking and the informational interviewing is a way to fill in what you don't know. But there's a middle step there, which I would just call market assessment. And I think, and maybe that's my legal background, but I need my clients to do their homework on paper first or online first, which is to take what they know about themselves and try to figure out what kinds of areas and industries interest them on paper, so that when they get to the point where they're actually talking to people, they can ask educated questions. So in my case, had the internet been around, I would have liked to have researched stuff on, say, marketing or brand management or even advertising or public relations, and looked at articles about people in those fields. Maybe find out which trade associations represent members of those fields and looked at those trade associations or their publications. Certainly look at websites where they describe those kinds of jobs, so at least I can talk the talk. Because one of the things that's very convincing to somebody that you're speaking with informationally is that you've done your homework, and that while yes, you're going to ask them to explain their business to you and what they do on a day-to-day basis, that you're not leaving it all in their lap. You're not saying, I'm unhappy, you tell me what you do. It's like, I'm frustrated, I think I need to use my creativity and my persuasive skills more. I've read up on brand management. I understand that part of what you do as a brand manager is help persuade people to make the purchasing decision for your brand. Tell me more about what you do. Right? So that homework leading up to the discussion makes you a better informed informational interviewee and helps the person talking to you realize that you're serious about it. That will in turn allow you a better dialogue and will help them understand that if you really are serious about it, when they make a future introduction, when they help you expand their network, they're not wasting somebody else's time.
Absolutely.
Right? So that you need to do that interim step. Having said that, how do you tell somebody about yourself? Well, before you even go into that meeting, you should know enough about what that person does or their industry to be able to make the connection. So, for instance, and this is the same kind of thinking I use when I'm helping people with their elevator pitches. I like to start out with, a little enough so that they can know who they're talking to. So maybe if you're an attorney and you're looking to change careers, you start out by saying something along the lines of, well, I'm a lawyer by education. Okay? So right now, that person knows you're smart. You have a credential. You have the discipline to go through a 3-year law program and pass the bar and maybe practice a little bit. That sets it up. But then I'd add a but, right? I'm a lawyer by education, but I have a real passion for, add in something, the food industry, children's issues, minority issues, the environment, whatever it is that this person is now connected to. So you're helping them understand why you've chosen them to talk to. And then you're saying, and I'd love to learn more or get more detail about that industry from your perspective. So you've given them enough to start the ball rolling and for them to understand why you're there, but then you throw the ball back into their court to start to talk, because I found that the best learning you can do, especially early on, is by listening. So if you can get somebody then giving you open-ended information about what they do, and they know all the time that you're trying to make that connection, that's the reason you're there, that's enough. You don't have to go on and on about yourself, and you shouldn't. You might say the wrong thing. It's much smarter to wait to let them start the talk and then fill in accordingly. Does that make sense?
No, it does. And I like the fact that it's, instead of just like a monologue, you're recommending more of a conversation starter.
It has to be, because you're there. You're not selling yourself in informational interviews. You're learning. You're asking. You're receiving. So the more you talk, the more you're not hearing. And there will be plenty. If this is a good connection, if you click with this person, there'll be the opportunities for future dialogue. But if you go in there and just prattle on and on about yourself, one, you won't get the information you need, and two, you run the risk of saying the wrong thing.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, Cheryl, this has been fantastic. I know there will be a lot of people that want to learn more about you. Where can our listeners go to learn more about you and your coaching practice?
Well, I appreciate that. There's 2 ways to reach me. You can certainly go to my website at www.lawternatives.com, and it's like you've got it up on yours, but it's LAWTERNATIVES.com. Or you can email me directly at cheisler, CHEISLER, at lawternatives.com. And if you're a professional, or if your listener is a professional and they've got follow-up questions on how do they find something that they might like better, that would be happier and more fulfilling, I'd love to talk with them. It's a great joy to be in this business, as you know, when you can help somebody find something that they love and they're happy, you're happy. So it works for everybody. It's kind of like the Cubs winning the World Series. It's not just the Cubs. Everybody except the Cleveland Indians are probably happy with what's going on.
Everybody wins. Well, Cheryl, thank you so much for joining me.
It was a pleasure. I appreciate you having me, and lots of good luck to you and to all the listeners.
Thanks, and thanks everyone for listening. Thanks to those who sent me questions. You can send me your questions to Angela@CopelandCoaching.com. You can also send me your questions via Twitter. I'm at Copeland Coach, and on Facebook, I'm Copeland Coaching. Don't forget to help me out. Subscribe on iTunes and leave me a review.
Thank you for listening to the Copeland Coaching Podcast today with your host, Angela Copeland. Tune in next time to get more great tips on turning your job search into a slam dunk.